If you had asked me a year ago, I would have described my life as predictable. Not perfect, but steady. I lived alone in a quiet neighborhood, content in my role as the doting aunt and reliable sister. My sister, Rebecca, had always been the star, dynamic, ambitious, the kind of person who made things happen. And then there was me, Natalie, the one in the background, keeping the pieces together. Rebecca's son Ryan was the light of her life. But even bright lights cast shadows. She loved him in her way, but her demanding career often left him in those shadows, searching for something she couldn't give. That's where I came in. I was the one who picked him up from soccer practice when she worked late. The one who helped him with his school projects. The one who reminded him that he mattered when life made him feel otherwise. I didn't mind. Ryan was a good kid, kind, thoughtful, with a sharp wit that reminded me of his father. At 16, he was taller than me, with a mop of dark hair and eyes that carried a depth I sometimes found unsettling. He was quiet but observant, the kind of boy who noticed things most people missed. It was one of those late evenings when everything changed. Rebecca had called, frazzled, asking if Ryan could stay the night. "Work's a nightmare," she'd said, her voice tight. "I'll pick him up in the morning." He told her it was fine, like I always did. Ryan showed up at my door an hour later, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his expression clouded. "Hey, kiddo," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Rough day?" He shrugged, avoiding my eyes as he dropped his bag by the couch. "You could say that." I didn't press him. Ryan wasn't the type to open up easily, and I'd learned to let him come to me when he was ready. Instead, I made us tea and settled onto the couch, turning on some mindless show in the hopes it might lighten his mood. But he didn't watch. He sat beside me, staring at the screen but not really seeing it, his hands clenched in his lap. "Ryan," I said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. "It's not nothing," I said, squeezing his arm. "Talk to me." For a moment, I thought he wouldn't, but then he exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Mom and I had a fight," he admitted. "She's always working, always too busy. It's like I don't even matter." My heart ached at the frustration in his voice, at the hurt he was trying so hard to hide. "Of course you matter," I said firmly. "She loves you, Ryan. She's just not always great at showing it." "That's an understatement," he muttered, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were stormy, filled with an intensity that made me pause. "Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his face. It was a small, instinctive gesture, but the way he looked at me made my breath catch. There was something in his gaze, something raw, unguarded, that I couldn't quite name. "You're not invisible," I said softly. "Not to me." His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. The touch was innocent, but the weight of the moment made it feel like something more. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with 1,000 reasons to break the silence, to put distance between us, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the pull of his gaze. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For always being here for me?" "Always," I replied, my own voice trembling. The rest of the night passed quietly. Ryan seemed lighter after our talk, his usual easy demeanor slowly returning. We watched another episode of the show, and he even cracked a joke that made me laugh. But as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The next morning, Rebecca came to pick Ryan up. She was her usual whirlwind of energy, apologizing for the inconvenience as she gathered his things. Ryan hugged me goodbye, holding on a beat longer than usual, and I felt that same flicker of something I couldn't name. As the door closed behind them, I stood in the quiet of my house, my thoughts a jumble. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew better. Something had changed, and there was no going back. The days that followed were restless. I tried to shake the feeling, to convince myself that it had been nothing more than a moment of overthinking, but every time I replayed the way Ryan had looked at me, so raw, so exposed, I felt my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite define. Rebecca called a few days later, her usual hurried tone crackling through the line. I've got a late meeting tonight. Can you take Ryan to his soccer practice? I'll pick him up after. Of course, I said automatically, though my heart skipped at the thought of seeing him again. When Ryan climbed into my car that evening, he seemed lighter than he had the last time I'd seen him. He smiled as he buckled his seatbelt, and for a moment it felt like everything was back to normal. Thanks for taking me, he said, his voice easy. Mom was freaking out about being late. No problem, I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. How have you been, Meta? He said, though there was a pause before he added, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I glanced at him briefly, catching the shadow of something in his expression. What I said about not being invisible, he clarified, his voice softer now. It meant a lot. His words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of guilt for the way my heart responded. You are not, I said firmly. Don't ever think that. He smiled, and for the rest of the drive, we talked about lighter things, school, his upcoming game, even a funny story about one of his teammates. By the time we reached the field, the tension I'd felt earlier had started to fade, but it came rushing back later that night. Rebecca texted to say her meeting was running long and asked if I could pick Ryan up instead. By the time we got back to my house, it was late, and I offered him dinner. We sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light creating an atmosphere that felt far too intimate. Thanks for everything, Ryan said, his voice quieter than before. I know you don't have to do all this. I'm happy to, I replied. You're family, Ryan. You don't have to thank me for that. He looked at me then, his gaze steady in a way that made my stomach flip. It's more than that, he said. You don't just do it because you have to. You actually care. Of course I care, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Why wouldn't I? I don't know, he admitted, his expression thoughtful. I guess I'm just not used to it. The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me, and before I could think, I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. You're not alone, I said softly. Not ever. His hand turned, his fingers curling around mine, and the touch sent a shiver through me. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Ryan, I began, but I didn't know what to say. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For everything. I pulled my hand back, the spell breaking as I stood to clear the dishes. It's getting late, I said, my voice unsteady. You should probably get some sleep. Yeah, he said, though he didn't move right away. When he finally stood, he hesitated in the doorway, looking back at me. Good night, Natalie. Good night, I replied, my heart still racing. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop replaying the moment at the table. The way his hand had felt in mine, the intensity in his eyes. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next week, I saw Ryan more than usual. Rebecca was busier than ever, and I became the default caretaker. Each visit felt more comfortable, but also more dangerous. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a quiet connection that grew with every shared moment. One evening we sat on the couch watching a movie. The lights dimmed. Ryan sat closer than usual, his shoulder brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, but it made my pulse quicken. I like spending time here, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. It feels different. Different how? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Better, he admitted, turning to look at me. Like I can actually be myself. His words sent a jolt through me, and I turned away, focusing on the screen. You can always be yourself, I said, though my voice trembled slightly. The tension lingered between us, unspoken but undeniable. And as the credits rolled, I realized I was holding my breath again, caught in the pull of something I couldn't define. "Thanks for tonight," Ryan said as he stood to leave. "I'll see you soon." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "See you soon." As the door closed behind him, I felt the familiar ache settle in my chest. Something was changing, something I couldn't stop. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rhythm of our lives had shifted. Ryan was at my house more often than not, and every time he left, I told myself I'd set clearer boundaries, that I'd distance myself. But every time he came back, I found those promises slipping through my fingers like sand. It was a quiet Sunday evening when the line between us blurred beyond repair. Rebecca had dropped Ryan off earlier that day, rushing to catch a last-minute flight for a work conference. He'd brought over his textbooks, claiming he needed a quiet place to study, though I'd noticed his focus waning as the hours passed. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the house was bathed in the soft glow of table lamps, and Ryan was sitting on the floor beside the couch, his books sprawled out around him. I was on the couch, my legs tucked beneath me, flipping through a book I wasn't reading. "You look tired," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. He glanced up at me, his dark eyes warm but tinged with something I couldn't name. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I don't want to go to bed yet." I set my book down, watching him for a moment. "What's on your mind?" I asked gently. He hesitated, his fingers playing with the corner of his notebook. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" His question caught me off guard, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but those feelings don't last forever. You'll find your place, Ryan. I know you will." He looked up at me then, his gaze steady. "I feel like I already have," he said softly. The air between us shifted, heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to look away, to break the moment, but his eyes held me in place. "Natalie," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to say this, but I feel different when I'm here, when I'm with you." My breath caught, and I forced a smile, hoping to deflect whatever he was about to say. "That's sweet, Ryan. I'm glad you feel comfortable here. It's not just that," he said, cutting me off. He stood then, moving to sit beside me on the couch. The space between us felt impossibly small. I don't know how to describe it, but it's more than just being comfortable. I froze, my mind racing. "Ryan, we shouldn't, please," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Just listen. I know this isn't normal, and I know it's probably wrong. But I can't stop how I feel." These words hung in the air, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "You're confused," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "You're young and—" "This isn't about being young," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "This is about you, about how you make me feel seen, how you make me feel like I matter." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I felt his hand brush against mine, the touch tentative but deliberate. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back instinctively, the spell breaking. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to—" "No," I said, my voice trembling. "But, Ryan, this can't happen." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't make it any easier." We sat in silence after that, the tension between us thick and suffocating. Eventually I stood, muttering something about needing to get ready for bed. He nodded again, not looking at me, and I felt the weight of his disappointment like a physical ache. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the honesty in his voice. It was wrong, I knew that. But it didn't make the feelings any less real. The next morning I found him in the kitchen, making coffee. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet. "Morning," I replied, unsure of what else to say. We moved around each other carefully, as if afraid to break the fragile truce we'd silently agreed upon. But when he handed me a cup of coffee, his fingers brushing against mine, the tension snapped like a rubber band. "Ryan," I began, but he cut me off. "Don't," he said, his voice firm but soft. "Don't push me away. Please." "I'm not," I said, though I wasn't sure it was true. "I'm just trying to figure this out." "Mine too," he admitted, "but I know how I feel. And I know you feel it too." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "We can't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it to him or to myself. He stepped closer then, his hand reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was simple, innocent even, but it sent my heart racing. "I'm not asking for anything," he said softly. "I just need you to know that you mean everything to me." His confession left me breathless, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Ryan, this is complicated," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," he said, "but that doesn't make it any less true." As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed an invisible line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. And deep down, I knew that whatever came next would change everything. The days after Ryan's confession were like walking a tightrope. Everything felt precarious, like one wrong step would send us both plummeting into chaos. I told myself to pull away, to set clear boundaries, but the truth was, I didn't want to. I felt seen, valued, in a way I hadn't in years. And that scared me even more than the consequences. Ryan stayed over more often. Rebecca, consumed by her endless work commitments, barely noticed. Each visit became another step into uncharted territory. We danced around the tension, careful not to address it directly, but it lingered in every glance, every shared moment. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Ryan reached for the blanket draped over the backrest. "Here," he said, spreading it over both of us. His shoulder pressed lightly against mine, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. We watched in silence for a while, but I could feel his gaze shifting toward me, the weight of his attention making it hard to focus. Finally, I turned to him, meeting his eyes. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Nothing," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You do just look peaceful." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I don't know about that." "You do," he insisted, his voice steady. "When you're not trying to carry the weight of the world, you look beautiful." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "Ryan," I began, but he interrupted me. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "And I wanted you to know." I looked away, unsure of how to respond. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. Later that night, as I cleaned up in the kitchen, Ryan appeared in the doorway. "Need help?" he asked, his voice soft. "I've got it," I replied, though I didn't stop him when he stepped closer. He reached for a glass on the counter, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Ryan," I said, my voice trembling, we need to talk." "No," he said, his gaze steady. "But every time we try, it feels impossible." He was right. Every time I tried to confront what was happening between us, the words seemed to catch in my throat. It was easier to pretend, to let the silence speak for us. But as he stood there, his hand still close to mine, I knew pretending wouldn't work forever. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, "but I don't want to stop." His honesty was like a punch to the gut, and I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "This isn't fair to either of us." "Maybe not," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "But it's real, and you can't tell me you don't feel it too." The truth of his words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve slipping. I wanted to push him away, to end whatever this was before it went any further. But when I turned to face him, the look in his eyes stopped me cold. "Ryan," I began, but he took a step closer, his hand reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Just let me be here for you. That's all I want." That night we sat together on the couch, the silence between us both comforting and charged. He didn't press me, didn't ask for anything more, but his presence was enough to make my heart race. When he left the next morning, the house felt impossibly quiet. I told myself it was for the best, that distance would help me think clearly. But as the hours passed, I found myself missing him more than I wanted to admit. The next time Rebecca dropped him off, the tension between us was palpable. He lingered in the kitchen as I made coffee, his gaze following me as I moved around the room. "You're quiet today," I said, trying to fill the silence. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice soft. "About what?" "About how everything feels different now," he admitted, his eyes meeting mine. "Like nothing's ever going to be the same." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I set the coffee pot down, turning to face him. "Ryan, we need to figure this out. Whatever this is, it can't go on like this." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. He reached for my hand then, his fingers intertwining with mine. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that made my chest ache. "You mean everything to me," he said softly. "I need you to know that." The rest of the day passed in a haze. We didn't say much, but the connection between us felt stronger than ever, an unspoken understanding that neither of us could ignore. By the time he left, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between what I knew was right and what I couldn't let go. As I closed the door behind him, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. This wasn't just a phase or a fleeting moment. It was real, and there was no turning back. The tension had reached its breaking point. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment felt like we were balancing on the edge of a precipice, daring gravity to take hold. I told myself this couldn't last, that eventually reality would come crashing down around us. What I didn't expect was how fast it would happen. It was a rainy evening when Ryan came over again. Rebecca had called earlier, asking me to keep him overnight while she dealt with yet another work emergency. I agreed, as I always did, though the weight of everything between us made it harder to breathe. When Ryan arrived, he was drenched from the rain, his hair sticking to his forehead, his shirt clinging to his skin. "You're soaked," I said, grabbing a towel and handing it to him. He took it with a small smile, his fingers brushing against mine. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. I tried to keep things light as the evening wore on. We ordered takeout, played a game of cards, and talked about his soccer team. But beneath the surface, the tension between us simmered, waiting to boil over. By the time the rain had eased into a soft drizzle, we were sitting on the couch, the remains of our dinner forgotten on the coffee table. The room was quiet except for the faint patter of rain against the windows, and I felt the weight of his gaze on me. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," he said, though his eyes told a different story. I like being here with you." The air between us felt thick, charged, and I realized I was holding my breath. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. "Ryan," I began, but he cut me off. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "Just don't push me away, not tonight." I didn't know how to respond. Every instinct told me to end this, to set boundaries I should have established weeks ago. But when I looked into his eyes, I felt my resolve crumble. Before I could think better of it, I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers with his. The simple gesture carried a weight that made my heart race, and for a moment, Neither of us moved. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't mean anything," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I know," I admitted, my voice trembling, "but that doesn't make it right." "Maybe not," he said, his gaze steady, "but it doesn't make it wrong either." His words hung in the air, and I felt myself leaning closer, drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. When his lips met mine, the kiss was tentative at first, as if he were giving me a chance to pull away, but I didn't. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, each movement filled with a longing that neither of us could deny. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the warmth of his touch through the thin fabric of my shirt. Time seemed to blur as the rain continued to fall outside. Every touch, every whispered word, felt like crossing another line. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. His hands moved with a care that made my chest ache, as if he were afraid of breaking me. At one point, he reached for the fruit bowl on the coffee table, picking up a strawberry and holding it to my lips. "Here," he said, his voice soft but teasing. "Something sweet." I took the strawberry, the juice bursting on my tongue, and he leaned in to catch a stray drop with his lips. The intimacy of the gesture made my breath hitch, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I couldn't ignore. As the night wore on, the lines between us disappeared entirely. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the room, and I felt as though we were the only two people in the world. When he whispered my name, his voice trembling with emotion, I knew there was no going back. By the time the storm outside had passed, we were sitting on the floor, our backs against the couch, the room filled with a heavy silence. Ryan reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "I don't regret this," he said softly, his voice steady. "Do you?" I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "No," I admitted finally, "but I'm scared of what happens next." "We'll figure it out," he said, his grip on my hand tightening. Together, for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. The world outside still raged with its judgments and consequences, but in that moment it didn't matter. What mattered was the connection we'd found, however forbidden it might be. As I leaned my head against his shoulder, the warmth of his presence grounding me, I realized that we were standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, and though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back.